same thing. Some countries already have competition policies specific to the digital realm. So we've got our general law, and agencies are using that, which is great. But there's some tricky things, and with AI, there's some questions. We've got civil rights and civil liberties bills that protect certain rights, but then there are special twists of online discrimination that maybe, and many of your bosses are sponsors of bills that try to do all of those things. So we are actually, and it's bipartisan, which is amazing, because these are issues that affect everyone. And so that is sort of the context of US basically starting to act, and the executive branch is also using tools it has, but doing executive orders and regulations to try and act in these spaces. I mean, I think in the House, when is the last damn time there was ever a 414-0 vote? Well, that was on that data bill from, 6 weeks ago. Shocking. Everyone was together on that, about making sure that data is safely stored and doesn't end up in the wrong hands. So with that sort of as the background, it's sort of a question about policy space, making sure that you guys have the territory you need to actually make those policies that the Congress people's constituencies are looking for. And the state of play right now is that it became clear to a bunch of people in Congress, including, I might add, a bunch of Republicans, because some of the most conservative senators wrote letters to the Biden administration saying, hey, no international preemption through trade agreements of what Congress is doing. We're the legislators here. Don't you guys do trade agreements that step on our territory? But also coming from progressives, coming from businesses. Some of the, not small, Yelp and Match.coms, those businesses were out there saying, hey, what do you mean? I mean, this is, what Leah was saying, what do you mean a trade agreement limits our ability to have competition policy? Says who? So all of this sort of bubbled up so that last year, the Biden administration started doing this interagency process that resulted in, on October in 2023, in October, what was called the removal of attributions at the WTO. That is like a WTO wonky way of saying we decide to review our policy. So at the WTO, the way you take a position is you associate yourself with a particular written position. And the agreement that is the context for this is a thing that does not sound like an agreement, the Joint Statement Initiative, the JSI. You hear people throw around JSI. And it's sort of a WTO proximate digital trade negotiation that has 90 countries. And this would set the global rules on these questions that everyone's mentioning. What is the policy space everyone around the world has as legislators on data flows and privacy and data security? What is everyone's space on competition policy, on content moderation, on consumer safety online, on civil liberties and civil rights online, all AI oversight? All of this stuff is being negotiated in a trade agreement in Geneva at the WTO. And so what the US government did is basically update what the US positions had been. So there have been positions tabled in 2019, before so much work was being done in Congress on all these issues, that basically, a way to think about it was kind of like it's a handcuff operation. It basically set very narrow parameters. You can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And so what the Biden administration did is said, that's not probably where we should be right now, given all this bipartisan legislation. We're going to just take our initials off of those provisions. And because the US is the US, when the US took the initials off the provision, that made it much more contested. So those provisions are still in there. There's a European version, as Leah said, like on data flows, the European provision, if you ask me, is a much more balanced approach. It says, okay, no data localization. Here are all the things you can't do to force companies to store. But here's an exception for privacy. And in the US, by the way, what isn't in the European position is to make for our existing laws, we need an exception for national security. There is not one in that agreement. So the European position plus a national security clause would basically provide the space of existing US law right now. Because we already have certain rules in the executive branch, we don't allow certain data related to national security already by regulation to go other places. Or everyone saw that executive order on national security and what data can go where. So that stuff already would be inconsistent, and the EU position, though it's better than what we had been on, wouldn't cover it. So they took our initials off of that one. They took our initials off a thing that was called source code. And that was a really peculiar rule, thank God, of the 200 digital trade agreements in the world. There are only 14 of them that have this rule, but the US was promoting it for the whole world. And that one said, you cannot have any oversight. You can't do detailed algorithmic assessments. You can't ever look at source code. So, I bet there are 30 offices in this room who have a co-sponsorship of one of those bills about surveillance, or the Fourth Amendment's not for sale. That's a very broadly co-sponsored bill. Those are all, or for that matter, the civil rights provisions, the privacy bills, that should be put back in. This is a fight, friends from Europe, that's happening right now about our privacy bill draft. Those all rely on algorithmic assessments. And that's just basically asking to say, all right, let's review what this thing is supposed to do. That rule that we took our initials off of said you are not allowed to have governments demand that information. So it'd be a little bit like having a drug agency where you're like, hi, we're supposed to make sure it's safe and effective, but you can't look at it. So we'll just throw it on the market and see what happens. So that rule we took our initials off of. Then there was another rule that was in there that had to do with the way that not just data can flow, but where you can store it and process it. We took our initials off of that one to get more balance. And then we took altogether out one that's called non-discrimination. And that was like the anti-antitrust rule, where basically anything that might have a disparate effect was considered discriminatory. So where we are now is there's another interagency discussion about what are the rules that we should be promoting in digital trade. For instance, do we even want rules now that limit the space? Because the final thing I will say is, and for a lot of folks who are sort of working out, I know there are a lot of tech staffers here, and you're thinking, why the hell do I have to hear about anything under the trade agreement? The secret trick about the trade agreements that a lot of people don't know is they all have a rule that says something like this. This is the WTO one. Each member shall conform its domestic regulations, administrative procedures, and policies to the undersigned agreements. And what that means is you have to conform your domestic laws, federal, state, and local, legislative, and regulatory, to the rules in the agreement. And if you don't, one country can challenge the other country and impose trade sanctions. So it's like a form of actually enforceable international law. Unlike, say, international labor standards, this has a punch. So you don't want to have enforceable constraints on policy in a trade agreement. And you can't change a comma unless all the countries agree. So you guys can decide, all right, that didn't work, we passed a bill, oh, that sucks. And then 10 years later you realize, oh my God, you can't actually change it because this trade agreement says so. So we need to sort out what we want to do domestically before we lock it in.